We talked about the word criticism in another podcast and the schools of criticism that people use to approach a piece of literature. It is helpful to approach this poem by using a little historical criticism. The poem was written in 1939. In 1939, Europe was in flames. Hitler and Mussolini, two aggressive dictators, were taking over everything. In 1939, it did look like totalitarianism might triumph across Europe and eliminate democracy. And even the free societies, the United States, England, and France, were restricting freedoms and increasing surveillance of citizens because they were afraid. That happens in times of war and instability. And it was in that environment that this poem was written. Now, as we read the poem, it's also useful to keep in mind another concept we explored in a previous podcast, dramatic irony. Remember that dramatic irony occurs when a character in a literary work, in this case a poem, says things that have a significance beyond which he realizes. Well, all that sounds pretty heavy, and the underlying theme of this poem is pretty heavy. But the poem itself is written in a light, humorous way. And before we jump into it, let's consider the parenthetical epigraph under the title. To J.S. 07378. This marble monument is erected by the state. It's kind of a joke that it rhymes. It's also supposed to be kind of a joke that this monument was put up by the government in honor of some citizen, apparently, who doesn't even have a name, just a number. The first little suggestion that this poem is going to be about dehumanization. Okay, let's read a few lines. He was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against whom there was no official complaint. And all the reports on his conduct agree that, in the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint. For in everything he did, he served the greater community. Except for the war till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired, but satisfied his employers, Fudge Motors, Inc. Yet he wasn't a scab or odd in his views, for his union reports that he paid his dues. Our report on his union shows it was sound. And our social psychology workers found that he was popular with his mates and liked to drink. Mostly in these podcasts, I've been talking about content. And since this is an introductory course in poetry, I haven't said too much about stylistic details. But note how this poem rhymes. It rhymes, but in an artificial way. Sometimes it seems that the line just keeps going until a rhyming word comes along. It's kind of a parody of formal poetry. And that's a word that we need to define. A parody is a nonsensical imitation of a literary work or style. Or, in other contexts, it can be a nonsensical imitation of a person or a point of view. But this is a parody of a serious, formal poem. Let's go back to these opening lines here. We should also think about the speaker of this poem. A very sincere voice. But the speaker here is a company man. When he uses the words our and we, he's talking about the popular, accepted point of view. And of course, the subject of this speaker's comments is this wonderful person, JS 07378, who has died, but who has lived such a wonderful life that a monument has been erected to his memory. So, what has made his life so perfect? Well, he did everything he was supposed to do. He worked at his job. He satisfied his employers. He belonged to a union and paid his dues. And furthermore, he belonged to the right kind of union. Sometimes unions can be full of rabble-rousers who aren't satisfied with their wages or working conditions. Sometimes unions go on strike. But we know this union is okay because our report on his union shows it was sound. And the social psychology workers investigated him and found that he was all right. He was popular with his mates and liked to drink. Let's read a little more. The press are convinced that he bought a paper every day and that his reactions to advertisements were normal in every way. Policies taken out in his name prove that he was fully insured, and his health card shows he was once in hospital but left it cured. Both producers' research and high-grade living declare he was fully sensible to the advantages of the installment plan and had everything necessary to the modern man: a phonograph, a radio, a car, and a Frigidaire. A Frigidaire was a refrigerator. Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of year. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says was the right number for a parent of his generation. And our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. A eugenist is a scientist who works to improve society by manipulating the population. Eugenics in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was a science that was taken seriously by many, although it's been altogether discredited today. Hitler, for example, was an advocate of eugenics. He believed that white, blue-eyed, blonde-headed people were genetically superior to others, so he encouraged those people to marry and have children, and he exterminated those he felt were inferior, like Jews. So what else is so wonderful about this guy? His reactions to advertisements were exactly what they should have been. He bought the right products, which helped stimulate the economy. He held all the right opinions, and we know that because he's been investigated. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. A perfect kind of a guy. Now, to go back to a line early in the poem, in the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint. Well, what does that phrase, "in the modern sense," mean? We know what an old-fashioned saint is. An old-fashioned saint is someone who holds strong principles and spiritual values and is willing to die for them. The person being referred to in this poem seems just the opposite of that. He doesn't seem to have any principles at all. So I guess the modern sense of that word turns it upside down. But the dramatic irony here is that the speaker doesn't realize he is turning the concept of a saint on its head. So let's look at the last 2 lines. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we certainly should have heard. Well, we need to define another term here, and that is rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is a question in which the answer is clearly implied. But these last two lines are a great example of dramatic irony. When the speaker asks those questions, he assumes the answer is yes. Of course he was free. Of course he was happy. But as readers, we understand that the answer is no. Of course he wasn't free. And as readers who have grown up in a free society, we have trouble imagining that a brainwashed person could achieve genuine happiness. And as readers, we understand that this guy was brainwashed. He didn't have an original thought in his head his whole life. He did whatever the government wanted him to do. He thought whatever the government taught him to think. He had no individuality. And because we live in a free society and value individualism, we can see what's lacking here. But the speaker cannot. He's just as brainwashed as the guy they built the monument for. Once again, more dramatic irony.